Good morning, and Pinjikio, welcome to the people of the area of Kingston, New York, to this presentation. I've been invited to this session by the Save Native Sites in Kingston, New York, in recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day, October 9th in the United States. And it's my pleasure to be here this morning to talk about Munsee, Delaware Nation history. And Nin Shinzi Kike Mark Peters. My name is Chief Mark Peters. And Ninun Jea Nalahi. I am from Nalahi, the Munsee, Delaware Nation. And Nalahi means up the river, which means up the river from Nahi. Lunaape Lakawit, which means down the river from us, our brothers and sisters at, like I say, Lunaape Lakawit, or what's also known as Moravian Town. Here on the Deshkan Zibi, as it's known by our neighboring Chippewa First Nation, and now known as the Thames River here in southwestern Ontario, Canada, a river that was called by us the Eskunasipi as well. So again, as I mentioned, it's my pleasure to be here to provide some of the history of, who we are, where we are originally from, and how we got to where we are now here in southwestern Ontario. And I usually like to do these things live through OBS software with all kinds of pictures and maps, but I'm just unable to do that at this present time. I want to make sure I can upload this to for people to be able to watch it. So there's some technical issues. But anyway, as I mentioned, my name is Mark Peters. I'm chief here at the Munsee, Delaware Nation. We're located in southwestern Ontario, Canada, on the Thames River. The map you see behind me is the first survey of the Thames River here in what was known as Upper Canada at that time. It took place around 1790. And it shows 3 Munsee, Delaware villages located where I am right now at that time. We came to this area on the Thames River, the Deshkan Zibi, in around 1783 at the end of the American Revolution. We were allies with the British Crown during the American Revolution. And because of that and the Britain's loss, I guess you could say, to the upcoming American nation, we were forced out of our homelands and even our new homelands in the Northeast and Great Lakes area here into Upper Canada. Before that, though, we were from an area that's become known as Lenape-Hoking. And that area stretches from the Delaware River, both sides, even west of the Delaware River towards the Susquehanna, right from the area of Easton or so up to the northern part of the Delaware River, and all the way over to the Hudson River and east of the Hudson River, starting in around Kingston, New York, and then all the way down to the mouth of the Hudson at Manhattan and including the western end of Long Island. This was has become known as Munsee territory, the territory of the Munsees, which were part of a larger group known as the Lunaape, which is very similar to Anishinaabe, the people from this area of the Great Lakes, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. And we consisted of three, I'm going to say tribes. That's the, I guess, academic word for it. The Munsees, north of the Raritan River, like I say, from the Hudson over to the Delaware. Then the Unaames in the southern part of New Jersey, and the Unalaktago, which I am pretty sure also is the what's known as the Nanticoke today. I'm not going to get much into the three tribes altogether. I'm going to stick to our Munsee speaking people's history mainly. And we lived there for quite some time. It's hard to say how long, but there's evidence that people have been living in this area since the end of the last ice age. Spear points have been found, Clovis, and even pre-Clovis points. And as from, 14,000 or more years ago, even going back from my latest research into 22,000 years or so ago, which with other projectiles that have been found show a continuous occupation of that area since that time until we were finally pushed out of that area in the 1700s. So we had a bountiful environment. We had everything we needed. We had beautiful houses and villages with cornfields and orchards, game to hunt and rivers to fish in, as well as the ocean, all kinds of food resources and other resources to live very long and healthy and good lives. We believed in a creator, a Manitou, as we also called it, known as Kishalamoquang. And Kishalamoquang provided everything to us, what I just described, to ensure that we could have good, healthy, and long lives. And we saw Kishalamoquang as a kind and generous creator. And we had a duty to thank Kishalamoquang on a regular basis for everything that was provided to us. And when you see people offering tobacco, that is an example of a continuing tradition in giving thanks to Kishalamoquang for all of this. And in addition to thanking Kishalamoquang for this, we also had an obligation to live a similar type of lives, kind and generous lives, and our children were taught from a very early age to live and think that way and abide by what's known here in the Great Lakes area as the 7 grandfather teachings: love, respect, truth, honesty, humility, courage. And there's one more, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But all those basic principles of being good and decent people. And when the first contact occurred in this area in the Northeast, when a man named Giovanni de Verrazzano came sailing up from, I think, the Carolinas up into Connecticut, stopping at many places along the way, he described a very healthy and kind and friendly people who offered him food and tobacco at every stop he made along the way. He only came into New York Harbor and observed a number of, I think, 30 or more canoes kind of coming out towards the ship, but then he had to turn around because a favorable wind was coming and continue sailing north. But his description of other First Nations, as I'm going to call them, we call ourselves First Nations here in Canada, were, as I said, a very kind and friendly people offering food and tobacco, and he describes many other interesting aspects about what we looked like and how we were, and even our environment. And in his own words, called this a beautiful land and a beautiful people, and one of the most civilized he'd met on his journeys. And I can't go into all the things he described, but when he left, he mentioned in his report to the King of France in 1524 that we had made good friends. And that's very interesting to me. And even John Heckewelder, the Moravian missionary who lived amongst us for some 50 years in the end of the 1700s, 1750 to about 1800, described our way of life, our civilization, as the kind of civilization that the philosophers of Europe have long been in search of. Quite contrary to the stereotypes that you see and hear about today. And after Verrazano left, there really wasn't much more contact with Europeans until around 1609, although there are records of a couple other ships coming into the area. The main records of the next contact come from Henry Hudson's voyage into the New York Harbor area and up the Hudson River to Albany, I believe, and then back down as he was searching for a passage to China, actually. And things didn't go quite the same with Hudson as they did with Verrazano. He was a lot more suspicious and cautious and did not seem to have the friendly type of attitude that Verrazano had. And although we seem to have made attempts to do the same that we did with Verrazano, Hudson was not quite so responsive, and even violence occurred during the time of his voyage up the Hudson and even in New York Harbor. But after Hudson's voyage for the Dutch West India Company, things began to change, and the Dutch West India Company made an arrangement to establish a presence on Manhattan Island. And the record of in the public sphere is that the island was bought for $24 worth of beads from the Indians. However, in oral traditional histories that I've read since that time, and 3 or 4 different occasions, it's mentioned that we provided land the size of a deer hide or a bullock robe for them to plant themselves on overnight, which meant metaphorically a period of 1 year. So it's quite a different concept as to how this land was originally settled or taken, you could say, in Manhattan. There actually is no deed for this supposed sale to, I think it was this director, Minuet, by the people in Manhattan. And Manhattan is a Munsee word, and apparently it means where the wood grows that bows are made of. This was the beginning of that more permanent contact, and there's many records from Munsees and Delawares after that, just how welcoming and hospitable we were to the people that first came into the area. And again, hospitality is one of the prime principles that I mentioned in the 7 grandfather teachings, that we had a duty to be hospitable to strangers who came our way. And we did so. However, that hospitality was taken advantage of, I believe. And again, things were twisted around in a way from how we saw our offering of land for a certain amount of time, and contrary to the Dutch West India Company's view that they had bought it and had permanent free simple rights to it, I suppose you could say. And this sort of relationship continued on for quite a few years after that. More and more land began to be settled and taken in this way. and more people began to come in to the area, and we began to get pushed out of our traditional areas and into more western locations. We were pushed from the areas of Long Island, Manhattan, Hudson River for over a century into the Delaware River area. And a lot of these instances of having to move were based on what I'm going to call land frauds, really, and the pressure of settlement, land speculators who could find any way they could to get the land and then to sell it or provide it to people coming in without notice to them that it was taken improperly in the first place. As well, there were a number of massacres in the New York area, including up in the Kingston area with the Esopus, and in the Manhattan area as well. And it seems to be becoming known that land sales seem to have increased, or I'm not going to call them sales, transactions, whatever they were, seem to have increased after these massacres occurred. And as well, disease was a very decimating experience for our people. The odd murder happening here and there, and just disputes among local disputes between us and people moving into the areas, livestock coming and ruining our crops, and we being blamed for other things. A woman picked a peach off a farmer's tree and was shot for it, and that started what's known as the Peach War and things like that. But by the year 1700, we'd lost some 90% of our population, actually. I think mostly because of disease, but also just from these other events, these massacres and murders, and alcohol was an issue. It caused severe health problems also. So the people that had been living in, like I say, western Long Island and Manhattan and Hudson River began to be pushed further and further west towards the Delaware River. And in a map of the first maps of the New York area, Hudson River, by Adrian van der Donk, I think in 1614 or something like that, and one later in 1649, show this area and all the villages, the many villages of Munsee-speaking people that occupied this area, and even going up to Kingston and the Esopus area, which if you go west from there to the top of the Delaware River is where the Minnesinks traditional territory was. And so as people began to get pushed west to the Delaware, all the people that lived in the Hudson and Manhattan area that began to get pushed over towards the Delaware, even though they had their individual names of who they were, started to become known as Munsees, which Munsee comes from the word Minnesink or Munsee, in the area, like I say, north of Easton up to the headwaters of the Delaware River. So that's how the term Munsee came to be applied to all of the people in this area that I mentioned earlier, and become known as speaking the Munsee language. And as I mentioned, many of the people from the Hudson seem to have moved also into the areas in the southern part of the Delaware River with the Lunaape Delawares, but also many began to move into the northern part, into the Minnesink area, as well, including, I believe, Esopus and Wappingers and others. And we continued to reside there as long as we could until actually in the 1740s when this event called the Walking Purchase occurred, another land transaction that's become widely and very publicly known as a great fraud, similar to all the other land frauds that happened before that, which resulted in us losing our final last areas of land in Lunaape. And we were pushed from there, from the Delaware River, even further west into the Susquehanna River and places called Shamokin and Wyoming, which is called Wilkes-Barre now, I believe, and all the way up the Susquehanna to its headwaters in the area of what was then the Five Nations or Haudenosaunee peoples. Others continued further west into the Allegheny and even the Ohio River. And then along comes what's known as the 7 Years' War, a war between Britain and France, one of a continuing series of wars for the last hundreds and hundreds of years, with one nation, France, coming from the west and wanting to claim these areas, and another nation, Britain, represented by the colonial governments in the area, coming from the east. And we were actually caught in the middle on the Susquehanna River area and other areas at that time. And there's a man named Paconchahalis who described to this man, Heckwalder, who I mentioned in the 1780s, about the American Revolution, but it applies here as well, how it seemed like we were caught between a pair of scissors. And if you look at a map that shows the French occupation and the colonial occupation in these areas, and they're coming together towards the Susquehanna, you can actually see what he means in this metaphor of being caught between a pair of scissors. And we had no choice but to choose one side or the other or get cut in half, basically. So at the beginning of this 7 Years' War, we actually didn't really side with the French, but we did take advantage of the situation. And because of the way we've been treated over, the past 100 or more years, massacres and disease and other things, loss of land, loss of almost everything except our own identities, culture, language, and that sort of thing, and having to continuously move, we took our frustrations regarding that out on the colonial peoples and governments that had taken our lands in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and caused a lot of damage to settlers, to militias and forts, and to the point where this stereotype developed of us as is actually written in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, if you read it, describing us as cruel, wild savages who kill women and children indiscriminately. That seems to come from this time period when we, like I say, took our frustrations out on the people who had put us in the position we were in, making it seem, however, like we started the whole thing. But eventually, a man named T.D. Eskung, there's a book about him called King of the Delawares, was able to get us together and work with the colonial governments to establish talks at Easton, Pennsylvania in 1756, resulting in a final meeting in October 1758 that lasted 25 days with some 1,000 First Nations people present and a number of Indian tribes or nations including the Munsees, and resulting in what's called the Treaty of Easton from that time. Although I won't call it a treaty, it's more or less a continuing part of this continuous land fraud, where we lost our final lands in New Jersey and New York as well, not really having much choice about it. What could we do? But anyway, this treaty occurred, and we then sided with the British Crown after that, even fighting the French in the final battles in Quebec and the Plains of Abraham. And after the 7 Years' War was over, Britain seemed to have come on to us with this heavy-handed attitude through this commander known as Jeffrey Amherst, who was in charge of the military in the area at that time. And their policy of friendship seemed to have changed to one of we have conquered you now, and we're going to tell you how it is. And even though it was the French that were conquered and not the First Nations, like I say, they took this attitude that they had conquered us as well. This resulted in what's known as Pontiac's War, where all of the First Nations in the Great Lakes and the Munsees were quite influential in how that occurred as well, in response to these new policies of the British Crown. And because of that, it resulted in what's known as the Royal Proclamation of 1763, wherein the British Crown agreed that any lands west of the Alleghenies or Ohio River were First Nations, were Indian lands, and could not be obtained except if we were to sell to the British Crown, who could then sell it to whoever they wanted to. And so this was part of the reason for Pontiac's War, as well as that the British did not dismantle the forts that they had established during the 7 Years' War, and other reasons. But we seem to have found some sense of security regarding the lands west of the Alleghenies, at least in this Royal Proclamation. However, this caused a lot of discontent among the colonial governments and resulted in a further war called Lord Dunmore's War, where many horrible things happened. And then finally the American Revolution, which, when you read about it, somehow seems to come with the impression that it was about tea and taxes. But really, in my view, it was about getting these lands west of the Allegheny and Ohio rivers that they were prevented from getting through this British Royal Proclamation. And even George Washington, as a land speculator, was part of this group of Virginians who did not like this Royal Proclamation, which prevented them from getting these lands. And I'm going to go so far as to say the reason for the American Revolution was to do just that. Because I can't get into specifics, but they're there showing that land was the real motivation for it. We have a wampum belt. Should have been ready for this. That hangs in the Museum of Natural History in New York City, that represents our allying with King George III, the British Crown during the American Revolution, and that belt represents a treaty between us and King George III for our alliance, and a promise of lands here, what was then known as Quebec, and then Upper Canada, and now Canada today. And we moved here, as I said, in 1783 at the end of the American Revolution, and with the consent of the local Chippewas in this area as well, who we'd had long-standing relationships with. because of that. However, the American Revolution did not end this land issue, and although Britain and America had agreed on the 49th parallel as the border between America and now what's becoming Canada, the First Nations, Indians of the Great Lakes area did not agree to this and continued to defend our rights to these lands in what became known as the Indian Wars, where we had many successes in repelling the American forces and then sorry about that disruption, but and then continued to like I say, fight for these lands until a final battle known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers in Michigan, where we were finally defeated and where we were hoping for assistance from the British. However, that never came. And we continued to live here on the Thames River during that time, but like I say, take part in these Indian wars and treaty discussions around it. We were involved significantly in another war that came along after that, the War of 1812, to again defend our territory here in Canada from an attempt by the Americans to take it as well. And if it weren't for our people and other First Nations in this area, it's quite likely that there would be no country known as Canada today. There's a book by a journal by a man named John Norton that describe our participation in this War of 1812, the severe casualties that we incurred, and other events about that. And actually, the interesting part about that, and even back into the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, is the type of tactics that we used, which became the basis for what are known as the special forces in American militaries today. After the War of 1812, which seemed to be the final war between Britain and America and involving First Nations and the Great Lakes, we've been at war since, like I say, the 7 Years' War in the 1750s until this point in 1812, which lasted until 1818, I believe, or 1816. So, having gone through all these other events that pushed us into the Susquehanna and Ohio, and then being involved in all these horrible wars that occurred for another 60 to 70 years after that, when we got to this area on this map on the wall behind me here on the Thames River, we, I guess, had hoped that we'd finally found a final place to rest and to recover and to continue to be the people we were and still are. We moved continuously and were pushed continuously over these long periods of time as groups, as villages, as nations, in order to maintain our identities as Munsees, our languages, our customs, our traditions, our ceremonies, all these things, our blood, to be able to keep ourselves intact and our identities intact as to who we are and were and are. However, after the War of 1812, colonial governments in Canada started to become more powerful, I guess you could say, and the faces and names of officials that we had known over previous years began to pass away, to move away, to just disappear. And these new colonial governments that came in forgot or disregarded the relationships, the treaties, the arrangements we had developed over the many, many decades and even centuries before that. And began again this series of land fraud transactions here in Upper Canada as well. And because of that, we began to send petitions to the Crown officials in the 1820s and ended up sending a series of these petitions to the Crown from 1820 to around 1909, 23 of them in all, very long articles that were provided orally to mostly military officers who were actually respected these past friendships and relationships we had and knew about them and our part in them, and wrote down these oral traditions from our people here where I'm talking from now, over the next 100 years after that. And that's where I got started in this history, was by reading those petitions and thinking, my God, what are they saying? Is this true? And by researching, I was able to find out that everything they said can be backed up with documentary evidence. However, these petitions were not listened to and were entirely disregarded. And the government never lived up to its promise of the treaty that I mentioned in the wampum belt I just showed. And we were left here now with 2,600 acres that we have today compared to the 12 by 12 mile areas of land that we were promised at the end of the American Revolution, and is resulting in a continuous land claim that we are taking against the federal government even today. Nevertheless, through all of this, we continued to farm this area to the point where we had some 2,200 acres under cultivation in the 1800s. And when you think about that, by hand and hard labor and horses and oxen, and they didn't have machinery back then. That's a lot of land to have under cultivation. And as well, we even hired a local settler by the name of John Carey to come and teach our children. In the 1820s, we probably had the first school in Upper Canada at that time, and he had at one point 16 Munsee students in his school in the 1820s. Like I say, as we continued to farm and be independent and be able to take care of ourselves. However, as settlers started to move into this area as well, all of a sudden the areas to go hunting in, to fish in, became a lot more restricted, and we were unable to do those things. So we had to rely on farming really as a way of economic independence. Like I say, we developed a school here to help our people, our young people especially, learn how to operate in this new world where we had to interact with the settlers coming into the area as well, reading and writing. And these aren't new either. Even T.D. Eskong back in the 1750s attempted to do the same thing before he was murdered one night by Connecticut settlers, and the other houses in his village were all burnt and everyone was forced to move at that time. But I'm not going to get into that too much. And even in 1849, we worked with the colonial governments here in a joint venture with the Chippewa Nations and Moraviantown, Nahi down the river, to establish what's called the Mount Elgin Industrial School. Again, a way for our people to learn different trades and reading and writing and all kinds of things. So that was initially a joint venture. This farming that we did was quite successful, like I say, and in the late 1800s, fairs began to, be developed in local counties and towns, and we began to participate in these fairs. And with our farming experience, we were able to win many of the prizes in a variety of categories at these fairs, to the point where the local non-native people became so concerned that they had to create what's called an Indian category, so that we weren't able to compete with them anymore and could only compete amongst ourselves. And it's an example of this incredible racism that existed back then, and even much more before then, and sometimes, in some ways, even still today. But around, well, in 1867, the British North America Act created the country of Canada basically as a somewhat of a colonial government to Great Britain, but gave this country certain powers under its own constitution. And from that, this new Canadian government started to develop what's called assimilation laws and policies. And one of these was the Indian Act in 1876. That's what the law is called, the Indian Act, which is still in existence today and still oversees what we can and can't do and who we are and all these other things. And we're working very hard to get out from under that. Things are going pretty well now, finally, but also it established the Residential Schools Act and other very harmful assimilation laws, even preventing First Nations from selling their produce, their farm, their wheat and corn off of our reserves to non-native people, preventing us from having a real economy. But the real damage was from this Residential School Act, which no longer could we just voluntarily have our children participate in education that we oversaw so that they could learn both our own traditional ways, these principles to live by that I mentioned, but also the important areas of non-native education that we hadn't really had before then, reading and writing and other things like that. Now our children were actually being forced to go into these, what they call residential schools, and that's even a kind of a very soft word to use for what they really were. They were almost like jail in a sense, really. I mean, you were sent there. You had no choice. If you were a child, you were taken from your family and taken to these schools where you had to reside and prevented from speaking your language and even punished for it in many, many cases, from learning your own culture, tradition, and ceremonies, and many other aspects of what had been our normal way of life before that. Children were put into forced labor, basically, into planting and taking care of and harvesting crops and dairy and all these other food products that they had to work in every day, and other aspects of domestic life that they were not able to share in the bounty of. And even the local residential school at Brantford here is nicknamed the mush hole because of what children were given to eat on a daily basis after they'd worked in the fields all day growing crops and milking cows and butchering and all these things that were then sold to other peoples to keep these schools running and to pay for the salaries of the people who were running them. But these schools continued on until the 1960s and 70s, even here in Canada, and resulted in a serious community breakdown, individual breakdown, and serious family breakdown as well. And in the 1960s, after many, many families had been broken down by these laws and policies, the government came into our communities and took children from families again, who they considered dysfunctional, and placed them with non-native families across the country. Some 150,000 children were attended residential school here in Canada, and we didn't have a very large population altogether at that time. And some 45,000 children were taken during what's known as the 60s scoop, when the government came in and took children from their homes to place with non-native homes. And I'm not saying these non-native homes were bad. In most cases, it appears they were good, caring, loving families. But what it is that, again, like the residential schools, it took away the opportunity for these children to learn who they were, their language, their customs, traditions, ceremonies, all of these things that the government had intentionally and very clearly made efforts to destroy. And it wasn't, maybe I'll just go back a bit, but our economy was basically stopped in its tracks when mechanized farm machinery began to come into the picture, and we could not afford to buy this machinery. We had no way to use collateral to go to banks to do that. And that's kind of when we began to lose our economic independence, in addition to all these other losses of our ways of life from these residential schools, resulting in serious problems. And the issues of alcohol that you see today, or actually not so much today as 30, 40 years ago, things are much better now. But that kind of started then, actually, and probably lasted a good 50 years as well. But after this 60s scoop in the 60s, when children were taken from their homes and placed in non-native homes, in 1969, the federal government introduced a final nail in the coffin called the White Paper, actually, and the intention was to do away with the reserve system, our land bases here, and to force us all into local towns and cities, and to finally assimilate us right into the mainstream society. However, they were not successful at that. What happened was many of our people began to rise up. Our leaders began to rise up against that, and it was actually taken off the table eventually. And again, the reason for it was mainly land. By forcing us off of our reserve lands, and especially in other provinces where there had never been any treaties, this was all still Indian land. It would enable the government to get hold of these lands and again continue to sell them to make money. So that's the real reason behind all of this. Even going back to the 1600s, I believe, is getting land for certain small groups of officials and individuals to make lots and lots of money off of this land by selling it to other people who had no idea of how it was obtained and the repercussions that would occur from it. But like I say, after this white paper failed in 1969, our leaders began to join together in a way that they hadn't before, resulting in 1982 the entrenchment of what's called existing Aboriginal rights into our Canadian Constitution. And the word existing was required to put in there by the government, who thought, well, there are no more existing rights. However, our courts, and mostly our Supreme Courts, have found contrary to that, and there are many, many existing rights that we still have, although they haven't been clarified quite as clearly as they need to be. What is coming along today is the government recognizing what are known as inherent rights, and those are the rights that we had before contact and even after that, those rights to have our own ways of government, our own ways of education, and all these other things that any society has to be able to function in their own unique ways. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that the government began to give us some control back in the communities that we live in, give us some control over our finances and our ability to develop our own programs and services for our people, to put our own infrastructures in place to do that. So that now we are getting quite strong here in Canada, both as individual nations like the Munsee Delaware Nation. We have two other nations that are geographically connected with us here on the Thames River, the Oneida Nation of the Thames and the Chippewa Nations of the Thames, as well as many other, again, what we call First Nations here in Canada, in this area, and throughout the province and Canada. There's some 600 First Nations in Canada altogether. We're also part of larger organizations, like we're part of what's called the Anishinaabe Nation, which is 39 First Nations here in Ontario, who work together to, again, further our goals to both maintain and get back out there all those things that the government has tried to take away from us: language, culture, tradition, history, all those things. So right now, like I say, here in the Munsee Delaware Nation, we have 2,600 acres that we live on. We have a regional police force, we have a daycare center, we have a nation office, we have a health center, we control our own elementary and secondary and post-secondary education. We have a healing lodge that we lease to what's called Monastic Child and Family Services, who provide services to our children and families to deal with the impacts of these past treatments we've experienced over many, even 100 or 200 years from our government, which have resulted in what we call Orange T-shirt Day here in Canada, September 30th, the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. That's been just this year recognized as a statutory holiday, and I don't like to use the word holiday, but a statutory day to recognize these treatments that we've experienced from the hands of our government, and kind of showing their change in attitude and policy towards that. So again, in addition to daycare, we have our own community center and different programs and services that we're providing to our people to help us all recover from the impacts of these devastating laws and policies, in addition to the experiences we had through all those wars, through all the disease and massacres and all the displacement and continuous movement, trying to keep ourselves together over, almost 500 years now. So we were there from the beginning, I guess you could say, of contact, and they're still here, even though many efforts have been made to get rid of us, to destroy us. We are still here as the Munsee Delaware Nation. And it's good to see people taking an interest in these things, our history, and maybe wanting to reconcile as well the past experiences and to find ways to understand each other and move forward into the future. So I don't even know how long I've been or when I started, but I think it's been about an hour. And I wish I could be there in person, but it's just so busy around here for one thing, and this COVID business is a bit of another thing, and the procedures you have to go through to get into the States and then come back to Canada. But I hope to be able to perhaps come down that way sometime and be able to talk person to person and to be able to answer questions and just talk and comment and that sort of thing. So I know I'm missing something here, but there's a lot to say. Our history is very, very long as far as when first contact started, and even much longer before that. And I've done 45 Facebook Live sessions regarding our history, about 45 minutes to an hour long. And I'm only at the year 1763 so far, so that just gives you some idea of how long and complex it really is. But I hope this gives everybody some understanding of who we are, where we are originally from, and how we got to be where we are today, and how things are today. I'd like to maybe say a little bit more about that, but I think I've given a general picture. So I'm going to say the Pish Kanawalomwa. We will see everybody, I hope, again in the future. And Anishik, thank you for being here and taking the interest to listen and learn about our history. Good day.